This is another episode of the Far Middle Podcast. I'm Nick DeOlius. Thank you for listening in. We've only got a couple days till Christmas if you're listening to this on the day of its issuance, and if you've got a bit of a delay between when we posted this and when you've listened, Christmas might be upon you or actually passed, and I hope you're getting ready for a great one or you've had a good one, depending on your timing. So episode 31 is where we're at Christmas week with the Far Middle. And the number 31, looking at our professional or athletic sort of dedication to this one, you know, the first gut reaction was that there's obviously a case for the great pitcher Greg Maddux, but I just can't do that. With the Atlanta Braves torturing my Pittsburgh Pirates in the 90s, as great of a pitcher that Maddux was, I just can't dedicate an episode of the Far Middle to him or to that one, somebody on that Braves team as great as they were. Sorry, apologies to Braves fans. Maddux was an unbelievable pitcher, if nothing else, because he was not by any stretch the most physically dominating or domineering pitcher or overpowering pitcher that you would ever see. In fact, he was quite the opposite. But boy, he had just great placement, great control, and made an epic career out of it. So great respect for Greg Maddux, despite the pain that he's inflicted on me. No, instead, with episode 31, I'm going to go with the dedication with Donnie Shell, the Pro Football Hall of Famer, Pittsburgh Steeler, great defensive safety. And I guess if we're going to dedicate episode 31 to Donnie Shell, we can also sort of have a sub-dedication there to another 31, his alter ego, in many ways his mirror image, at the same time, same era on the Oakland Raiders with Jack Tatum. But Donnie Shell sort of being front and center for this dedication for a couple of reasons. I mean, obviously, part of the Steel Curtain, the greatest football dynasty, greatest football defense of all time, 4 Lombardi trophies that Shell had during his career, 5 Pro Bowls. Recently, a recent inductee to the Pro Football Hall of Fame up in Canton, which I think was very well deserved. But what really always intrigued me about Shell, and why I want to put him up there as the focus for episode 31, is his backstory. He's got a really interesting backstory. And that story really starts with where he grew up, where he went to college. He went to South Carolina State, not University of South Carolina, but South Carolina State. And ironically, or interestingly, he played at the time with what was going to be another Pro Football Hall of Famer, Harry Carson, who ended up, of course, with a great career with the New York Giants. But he was not drafted. Donnie Shell was not a drafted player in the 1974 draft when he graduated and came out and was looking to play professional football. He was an undrafted free agent signing by the Steelers, of course, but the Steelers had a scout for many years by the name of Bill Nunn Sr., an African-American gentleman who just came up with just amazing talent for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Really was one of the key figures that built the dynasty in terms of what it was on both the offensive and defensive side of the football. And he also, Bill Nunn Sr., is in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, a recent inductee as well, and well-deserved, got there in his own right. And a Pittsburgh native, so Bill Nunn Sr. was from the Steel City originally. And why was he hired by the Steelers? Well, predominantly his focus was one on looking at talent coming out of the historically black colleges and universities. So he was a scout that really honed in on those types of schools and areas that were oftentimes overlooked, didn't get all the spotlight and attention that a lot of the big name programs would receive. And there was a tremendous amount of talent coming out of historically black colleges and universities at the time when it came to the professional football ranks. And that's how Donnie Shell was discovered. It was effectively through Bill Nunn Sr., also another guy that he was famous for discovering with a similar type of a backstory, a wide receiver by the name of John Stallworth, who also ended up playing for the Steelers and got into Canton, got a bust up in Canton, Ohio. Bill Nunn Sr., 6 Super Bowl rings, so he was with the Steelers for a long period of time. And interesting with him, it's like shells within shells with Donnie Shell. Bill Nunn Sr., before he became a scout for the Steelers and set off on that awesome career, he was a reporter for the Pittsburgh Courier, which was a famous African-American newspaper in the Pittsburgh area. And when he was a reporter for the Courier, one of the things he did was he published lists each year of black All-American football players across the country. This is how he became very familiar with the coaching staffs and players and programs across these historically black colleges and universities. And one of the players that made it on one of his year's All-American lists, Bill Nunn Sr.'s list, was a player by the name of Ed Tomlin. And Ed Tomlin is the father of Coach Mike Tomlin of the Pittsburgh Steelers today. So sort of an interesting sort of degrees of separation, so to speak, or how things work when it comes to life that I thought was pretty cool when you start thinking about Donnie Shell and his story. Now, Donnie Shell was part of, as I said, the 1974 class of the Steelers, including the draftees. And again, Shell was an undrafted, free agent signing. And when you look at that 1974 class, I don't think there's been a better draft class by an individual team in the history of the draft itself. There were 5 Steelers that were of note in that 74 draft. You had Lynn Swann, who was drafted from Southern Cal, USC. You had Jack Lambert, who was drafted from little-known Kent State up in Ohio. You had Mike Webster, who was drafted from Wisconsin. Stallworth, as I mentioned, John Stallworth from a small college, Alabama A&M, not Alabama, Alabama A&M. And then, of course, the undrafted free agent Donnie Shell from South Carolina State. That's 5 individuals, 5 Hall of Famers, all of them in Canton, Ohio. Pretty unbelievable. 3 on offense and 2 on defense. So no 1974 draft and undrafted free agent class, then no Steelers dynasty, no Bill Nunn Sr., no Steelers dynasty. Donnie Shell, I think, is a case in point on both of those positions. He was a great player. He had a great career. He has a great story, but he's an even greater person. So a well-deserved dedication of episode 31 of The Far Middle to the great Donnie Shell. I think we've got a really interesting serendipitous path of dots to connect on this episode of The Far Middle, starting, of course, with Donnie Shell being a safety. So let's start our journey. Safeties, when you think about what they're doing in football, what do they have to be really good at? Aside from all the different physical traits or characteristics, well, they got to be really adept doing risk-reward math, and they've got to do that risk-reward math with split-second timing. So those calculations in their head, it almost has to be innate. It's just got to be something they can do at a split second's notice, and their ability to do so is going to determine the difference between a Hall of Fame caliber player and someone that gets completely washed out quickly within the process because they can't do that math quick enough on a fast enough moving basis. So the type of risk-reward math that safeties do, right? Do you move up to stop a run, or do you stay back if it's a play-action fake and you cover the receivers instead that might be going deep? Do you go for the ball, or do you defend the receiver at the crucial moment? When do you look back to see if the ball is in the air or where it's at versus staying on the receiver that you're covering? Do you provide support over the top to one receiver or the other one if you've got 2 going deep? So those are the types of calculations and assessments you need to make on the fly under risk-reward of each individual path that you can choose. Now, this risk-reward math that you saw with Donnie Shell and then with safeties in football, it's the same type of thing. It's the same type of important skill when it comes to pension and fund managers and any of those individuals who are running those types of entities and institutions who are investing our money in capital markets. So we want our money managers, our pension managers, to be really good and really astute at risk-reward wizardry. And we want them to clinically choose the best balance to protect our assets, our retirements, our future payment streams, whatever the case might be, our returns. But that, unfortunately, is not what's happening today in too many instances, and particularly with pensions. And we've talked about this before. It was actually a chapter within my upcoming book, Precipice, The Left's Campaign to Destroy America. And we talked about it in the context primarily of public pension plans and public pension plan managers. But you're seeing this evolve and grow, frankly, across not just public pension plans, but also with investment houses and ETFs and mutual funds and those types of entities and institutions. And what you're seeing is increasingly a jettisoning of fiduciary duty of the pension or the fund manager to look after their fiduciary, their beneficiary when it comes to protecting assets, getting the best return for risk balancing, making sure that you're trying to secure the future payment streams that have been promised, let's say, to retirees, whatever the case might be, depending on the entity itself. And you're jettisoning that and replacing it with what? It's being replaced with effectively an ideology, of course, that is embracing all kinds of different views on everything from climate change to leftist ideology across a number of different spectrums, et cetera. So sort of the science and the math of risk reward and that clinical approach that you'd want to see, being able to do that on a day-by-day fluid basis to optimize performance, it is now being sort of demoted and placed underneath what the political science is and what the ideology beliefs might be that are popular or being driven by that entity or by the leadership of that institution. Now, just to give you an example of how prevalent this is, so you're not just taking my word for it here. What I've done is I've subscribed to a periodical. It's sort of the go-to paper for those that work in pensions, public or private, those that work in investment houses, that everybody reads, everybody references. It's the lead sort of periodical in that space. And this issue was from late November of this year, so it's the most recent issue. And all I did was I took the actual hard copy and I just circled all the articles in this issue that deal with the subject that I just spoke about, how, again, that risk-reward clinical math of protecting assets, maximizing returns, mitigating risk, protecting future payments, that has been supplanted by more of the political science and the rhetoric and the ideology. So I'm just pulling this from the current issue. On the front page alone, the entire front page deals completely with the political science and the ideology. We've got an article talking about new SEC guidance from the Securities and Exchange Commission that is going to open the door for more environmental social governance or ESG proxy proposals, and how the goal of it, and both the goal can be stated or the goal can be implicit, is to basically create a flood, a tsunami of E&S proposals to end up in company proxies, public company proxies, when it's time for the annual annual proxy season. You've got another front page article that is talking about one of the largest pension funds in the nation, definitely a top three, almost $500 billion in assets. But what are they doing? They're starting to understand, I guess, while they're focused on, and this is a public pension plan. It's very famous for focusing on ideological issues, but is also facing some funding issues when you look at its commitments versus its assets and its inflows versus its outflows. But what are they doing? Well, because they're falling behind while they're distracted on sort of the ideology, now they're having to find ways to juice their returns in a return-challenged environment because of things like zero interest rates and sky-high equity valuations and seller low yields on debt instruments. So now they're having to amp up their risk. And the way they're doing that is they're putting more of the asset allocation that they're investing into private debt. They're putting more into private equity. They're putting more into real estate. And they're using leverage. They're using debt to try to juice those returns. Now, all of these moves, right, are doing a couple of things. One, you're amping up your risk because you need to get basically a higher return. So you're going into these alternative type of investments and using leverage, which of course using debt's always going to be risky. But two, they're also investing in more illiquid assets, which is going to have some complications if things turn south, and a pension like this would need to raise liquidity. So, the risk meter is getting amped way up at a time when most of the public posturing of this public pension plan is nothing about risk reward and returns and investment risk thresholds. It's much more about what's going on the ideological front. Another front page article here is talking about how BlackRock, right, has reached this is an amazing statistic, a $10 trillion level of assets under management. That's an unbelievable number. $10 trillion, just to put that in perspective, the only two countries that have a higher GDP than 10 trillion is China and the United States. So like BlackRock, wow, has a asset under management level that is exceeding the GDP of every other nation on earth that's not named United States or China. Pretty amazing how big and how large some of these investment houses have become. And again, what they do, what they focus on, how they go about, fulfilling their strategy, that's going to have an outsized impact on a bunch of other things just because of the size of what they're doing. So as I flip through this, I go to sort of the second, third pages, another article on another major public pension plan, this one up in Canada, that is going to basically start investing And this is an interesting one. They're going to invest in fossil fuel type or energy type companies, and they're going to do that and then push to have those companies decarbonize the businesses. So that's an interesting sort of proposition. I'm going to invest in a company that I think is a good investment that is basically in a business of providing carbon for the world, for quality of life, for all the great things that carbon does. And then I'm going to work with them, persuade them to exit that business. That's an interesting investment thesis. And again, I'm not sure if the retirees of this public pension plan are predominantly interested in that objective strategically, or more making sure that they're investing in the right companies that got good return prospects that will guarantee and protect the future payment streams that the retirees are expecting. Another article, investors is talking about investors who are pushing for the green energy transition to be fair. So you're seeing a lot of this now where these capital market entities, whether they're pensions or other, they're pushing and creating a bit of havoc with respect to different industries and companies in those industries. That is limiting, in some instances, access to capital, or it's increasing volatility. And then there's this inevitable fear of what happens when these industries and companies go away and all the people that work in these industries. Well, this speaks to what's going on or what happened in Glasgow at COP26 and that fiasco, and all these different sort of charters that you're seeing in the capital markets by capital markets groups. And basically, it's these commitments that are saying we're going to have energy transition strategies that are going to make sure, while we're wrecking industries and manipulating markets and protecting certain markets and destroying other markets and all that collateral damage, we're going to make sure that the collateral damage doesn't have workers in those industries left behind, right? In that march to zero carbon or whatever fantasy we're chasing. So this is sort of under the subject of, to the worker, to the common individual or person out there, this isn't going to hurt a bit. We'll see. We'll see how bad it hurts or if it doesn't hurt. Just flipping through here a couple more pages. Let's see, what else do we have? Oh, here's a couple of articles. One, a very well-known politician and activist putting some heat actually on university endowments. So some of these universities and colleges, we spoke about this in prior episodes of the Far Middle, massive endowments, huge endowments, especially, typically the more elite the university, the bigger the endowment. Well, they invest those assets. And, there's a push now that, and this is interesting because universities, of course, are often, as we've spoken about, the hotbed of a lot of leftist ideology, a lot of criticism of capitalism and public companies and whatnot. Well, now you've got this interaction where the activist politician is insisting that the endowments sort of, eat what they cook. They're following, they're backing up their actions with words when it comes to who's managing their endowments, where the endowments are being invested. Is it fair? Is it equitable? All those nice words. So it's interesting to see that sort of exchange. Another article about how investors are becoming more wary of ESG claims from companies. They took a survey. And yeah, I agree with this. They should be wary because I think a lot of the ESG promises or positions are basically fiction, and companies sometimes or industries just say that to put something out there without much thought of how they're going to get there, or where the math is that's going to get them there. But this survey was interesting. 95% of the respondents in the survey, who are basically money managers, said they are more interested in taking an activist approach to investing. Now, what that means, right, it depends on who you're talking to and how they define activist, but does a investor, a retiree, a current worker in a pension looking at someday to become a retiree, are they interested in the people looking after their money being more activists when it comes to pushing certain views or ideologies with where their money's going? Or are they more interested in making sure that those money managers are doing the right risk-reward analysis to protect their future interests and their current assets? I think I know which answer I'm going to subscribe to. Another article about ESG ETFs, so this environmental social governance electronically traded fund type of industry, which is just growing by leaps and bounds. It's talking about how it continues to grow. But an interesting little subpoint in here, and this is something, again, that we've hit upon both in the Far Middle and in my book Precipice, that if you look at the data, there's a discussion here that the long-term performance of these ESG ETFs, it's basically in line with their market risk. So that's a nice way of saying that if you look at the performance of a lot of these ESG ETFs, their returns are no different on a cost-adjusted basis than what a standard market benchmark would do, thus no performance differentiation. So there's still this big debate about ESG investing, whether or not it's going to generate, at least in terms of how it's currently widely practiced, whether ESG investing is going to generate a risk-adjusted outperformance or not. I am highly suspicious as to whether it will. And let me see if there's anything. I think that was basically the bulk of it. But you get the flavor for this. This entire issue of that periodical was completely consumed and dedicated to this focus on ideology and political view and rhetoric, and very little discussion on what's going on with the actual math, the Finance 101, returns, liquidity, funding status, all those things that are really near and dear and important to the beneficiaries, whether it's the investor or whether it's the active worker or whether it's the retiree, who are relying on these leaders of these investment entities and pensions to do their jobs. Now, if we continue on this serendipitous journey and we go from how distraction or other things, ideology, sort of supplanting risk-reward, clinical decision-making of pension fund managers can hurt the quality of the pension, the performance of the pension, you see that same dynamic occurring outside of the investment world. You see it everywhere. And I'll give you two examples. One is in the arena of all things comedy. I recently had a chance to see one of my favorite comedians live, Sebastian Maniscalco. He's hilarious, I think, if you're familiar with him. If not, give him a look. I think you'll enjoy him. But he came to Pittsburgh recently and was able to enjoy his show. And listening to him perform live and just thinking through, knowing him for a while and seeing him a couple of other times, it really brought to my attention this issue in the arena of comedy. And it's tough today for comedians in terms of how they approach things. So first, right, you had COVID and pandemic that just sort of threw a monkey wrench into their livelihood for years. Their livelihood is live performance, and pandemic obviously just disrupted that in a big way, along with a bunch of others. And then second, and this is the bigger thing, what is safe to parody or joke about these days? That's a narrower channel than what it used to be, and you have to be careful. A comedian has to navigate that carefully. And so Sebastian, he was still funny, for sure, no doubt about that. But you could tell, you could literally see that he was guarded and how he crafted his jokes or his stories. He's very careful as to where he went and what he said. Now, would he have been funnier if he had to be less sensitive on the political correct spectrum or less sensitive on woke issues? I'm not sure. I mean, would the audience have benefited from it? I can't say. That's impossible perhaps to say. And on the one hand, I get a lot of that. I don't like particularly jokes or comedians who are aiming to belittle whatever group or belief or whatever thing they're going after. Sometimes, that's not funny. That just becomes basically just mean. There's a difference between being mean and being funny. But on the other hand, what was funny or hilarious, widely believed to be 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and was totally acceptable, today some of that is going to get a comedian into some serious hot water. And in that regard, I guess comedy and its audience, right, that consuming it, just like the retiree or the worker or the investor with capital markets, the audience suffers. They basically consume a less superior product than they would have. And I thought it was interesting to see Sebastian perform as sort of came to light. And then another example that's sort of related to that outside of comedy is with, of all things, restaurants. So when you've got different policies, whether it's energy policy or just leftist policy in general, that's aimed to sort of impact the economy, impact capitalism, business owners, etc., the results, the symptoms, they manifest themselves in unexpected ways. And one of those things that you're seeing in one of those arenas that you're seeing it manifest is when it comes to restaurants. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's this epidemic going on across restaurants where, whether it's because of increasing food costs, again, driven largely by the intended consequences of policies that were ill-advised, or staffing shortages. So we talked about worker participation and all of those trials and tribulations before on the far middle. Again, intended by ill-advised policies, or a whole bunch of other issues that the restaurant industry is facing. What you're looking for is where restaurants are supposed to be making a comeback these days, coming out of shutdowns and pandemic. 60% of restaurants reported reducing menu size when you look at a recent survey that was performed in the food industry. So basically 60% of your restaurants, because of staffing shortages, because of increasing food costs, because of all the start and stops of all these heavy-handed pandemic policies in cities and different states and, frankly, nations, more than half of the restaurants out there have significantly shrunk their menus compared to pre-pandemic. And it was interesting, the CPI index for food away from home, which is actually a subcategory of the consumer price index, food away from home, which is basically purchases from restaurants. It's up almost 6% over the past year. That is the largest 12-month increase since 1982. And that's coming from the government itself, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So this stuff, whether it's leftist ideology, ill-advised government policy, economically, energy, otherwise, workforce, all those things, it has an impact. It affects the type of comedy show product that you enjoy when you go see a comedian live. It impacts what you can basically choose off of a menu when you're enjoying a night out with whoever at a restaurant or your favorite local spot. And this brings us sort of to our next little step in this journey for this episode, which is when you get away from clinical risk-reward math and when you get away from sort of the rational economic policies and you move towards the ideology and towards the political science and all those other things, you also see a manipulation, a messing with of statistics and a bit of a distortion, I'll say it, all under sort of cover of, hey, we're following the science, that type of thing. Whenever I hear someone say we're following the science, I almost want to go a layer deeper to see, well, what is that? Give me the view. Show me the math. Show me your work, as they used to say in school. Show me your work when you took a math exam or an engineering exam or a science exam that got you to your answer so that I know you understand and you're basing this on sound science and reason. And one of the best examples I can give you of this, I mentioned with comedians and restaurants sort of being hit hard by pandemic and COVID, is in the arena of COVID. And it's just a pair of statistics that are really interesting. Both of them, by the way, completely factual. But depending on how you use or apply them, you can come up with very different conclusions and then say, again, that you are following, quote unquote, the science. So the one statistic, and this is from the U.S. government, is how many Americans have been estimated to be infected by COVID. Now, this data point is as of early October. So this was October 2. So if you fast forward today, the number I'm sure is significantly higher. But as of October 2nd, the government estimated that 146 million Americans had been infected with COVID. Okay. Now, here's the second statistic. The second statistic is that recently we've hit the 50 millionth, so 50 million confirmed cases of COVID. So the difference, of course, one is an estimate of how many people had COVID but didn't get tested or were asymptomatic. It wasn't an officially reported statistic. That was closing in on 150 million. And the other statistic is how many went to the hospital or had a test and were tested positive and counted as COVID positive. That's 50 million. Now, depending on which one of those you use, you can come up with very different conclusions on what the views would be of, let's say, pandemic and COVID. If you use the first view, you could say the 150 million and now higher because that was as of October 2. We've reached through that and vaccinations, basically herd immunity, and it's now time to move on and manage this and basically protect the most vulnerable the best you can, but you tailor that. You don't go with widespread, whatever it is, economic shutdowns or school closings or mask mandates and travel bans and all these other things. The other view is if you want to take the other side of the view, you say, well, there's 50 million now that we're coming up on confirmed cases. If we shut down, if we mandate this, mandate that, ban this, ban that, we can stop COVID from spreading to the vast majority of population. It is yet to be confirmed COVID positive. So you see how you can take completely different stances using the convenient statistic of choice. And if you're not providing that proper context of 50 million officially reported COVID cases and positives versus 150 million or 150 million plus at this point in time actual COVID cases based on the science, you can manipulate and lead people to the conclusion that you want them to reach. And I think that's occurring to wide extents, not just when it comes to pandemic, but when it comes to a lot of economic policies that you're seeing bannered about, when it comes to a lot of energy and climate change policies that are out there, and when it comes to a lot of fiscal and monetary policies that are being bannered about by leftists and socialists at large. This is going to wrap up episode 31 of the Far Middle Podcast. I hope you had a good time listening in. I think this was an interesting journey. As I said, it has some twists and turns, but you could see the interconnectivity. It sort of worked out pretty well, starting with Donnie Shell and talking about the role of safeties in football and risk-reward math, and then getting into how risk-reward math and clinically approaching that can create really great performance when it comes to pensions and investment vehicles. But if you demote that and put in front of it, chasing ideology or political beliefs, the quality and the performance of those plans will suffer. And then we talked about how that can also hurt the quality of other things beyond investing in investment entities. We talked about what's going on with comedy these days and comedic performance. We talked about, of all things, right, restaurants and menu choice, how that's being impacted because of things other than the reasoning and the logic and the risk-reward math is driving decisions in business and in society and in government today. And then we got into just how statistics can be used or manipulated when not in proper context to drive or slant views or consensus on really big things. We talked about COVID, right? We talked about the difference between 50 million officially confirmed cases of COVID in the United States versus about 150 million estimated infected individuals of cases of COVID in the United States. And if you just use the 50 million official cases out of context and by itself, you can lead one to believe that a whole bunch of policies would be in store or in order, but not understanding the full context, you come to a very different conclusion. So got a lot going on these days. Precipice, the left's campaign to destroy America, hits in a couple weeks. Give it a look or a pre-order on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Of course, always on Twitter, @NickDeolius. And nickdeolius.com, the website. We've been posting some really interesting new commentary and content recently. Give it a look. We got a list of the 10 greatest rock guitarists in rock history. Got a note up there I put on Genesis and their recent show. Let me know what you think. Santa's coming. Get ready if you haven't already. Put that tree up, string those lights outside, get in a good mood. I will leave you with my top 3 Christmas albums of all time if you're looking for something to play. Number 3, Johnny Mathis, Christmas. Can't beat that one. He is the master of the Christmas album. I've been listening to that album since I was a little kid. That's the one of him standing there holding a pair of skis on the cover. Johnny Mathis is awesome, and it doesn't get much better than that when it comes to a Christmas album. Number 2, the Nutcracker Suite, in the full Nutcracker, not the abridged or shortened version. Give it a listen. It's timeless. It's awesome. Everybody loves the Nutcracker. There is one exception to that. A good friend of mine, Tim, he hates the Nutcracker, and the reason he hates it is that his wife is an instructor with the youth ballet in Pittsburgh, and his daughter, when she was younger, was performing in the youth ballet, and every year their biggest production was, of course, the Nutcracker, and the rehearsals of that would start back in June, at the start of summer every year, and Tim, unfortunately, was just inundated with the Nutcracker at home and for performing. He just was consumed by the Nutcracker for years, and I don't think he can take another single additional listening of it. But Tim aside, you can't go wrong with the Nutcracker. And then my number 1 all-time choice, this may seem like a bit of an odd one, but definitely my number 1 is the Peanuts Christmas soundtrack with Charlie Brown Christmas. Now, you might think that that's weird to have a cartoon soundtrack as my number 1 all-time Christmas album, but it's really not a cartoon soundtrack. It's a jazz soundtrack because Charles Schultz, back in the day in the 60s, when he was creating these specials, including the Christmas special, he had the foresight. He was really a visionary, wanting to insert basically a jazz series of compositions for those soundtracks. And he hired Vince Guaraldi and Vince's trio, to perform and compose those pieces. And it's awesome. Give it a listen. Peanuts Christmas, Charlie Brown Christmas. My favorite is O Tannenbaum, that never gets old in my book. Merry Christmas, everybody. Talk to you soon.